What does a man do when the law takes everything he's built and hands it to the very man who is supposed to protect it? This is the story of George Swanson, a fourth-generation wheat farmer from Montana whose family lost their 120-year-old homestead to foreclosure in the summer of 1987. But what the banker who seized his land didn't know was that George wasn't the kind of man who stayed down. And what he built in silence over the next 8 years would become the most precise, most patient act of justice that Millbrook, Montana had ever seen. If you want to know how a man with nothing but a name and a grudge can end up holding the deed to his enemy's front door, hit that like button and let's get into this story together. George Swanson stood at the fence line of the farm his great-great-grandfather had broken from raw Montana prairie in 1867. Cowboy hat on his head, foreclosure papers in his hands, golden wheat stretching behind him as far as the eye could see. The morning sun caught the fields at that hour when everything looks like it was made to last forever. It wasn't going to last the afternoon. Behind him, the white farmhouse stood quiet. The red barn cast its long familiar shadow across the yard. His wife Ellen sat in their truck with their 2 children, Claire, age 9, and Daniel, age 7. Watching strangers in county uniforms walk through gates that still had the Swanson name on them. Victor Caldwell arrived last. President of Caldwell Agricultural Bank, pressed suit, polished shoes entirely wrong for a dirt road. He extended his hand to George the way a man extends a hand when he knows the other man has no choice but to watch. George didn't take it. "I'm sorry it came to this," Caldwell said, in the tone of a man who was not sorry at all. "The bank has obligations, you understand. 4 generations of Swanson farming, gone before noon, taken for $80,000 in unpaid debt and quietly resold to developers 6 months later for $310,000. But as George watched strangers walk through his grandfather's barn that morning, something shifted behind his eyes. Not grief, not rage. Calculation. George Swanson didn't fight Victor Caldwell that day. He didn't make a scene. He didn't make threats. He did something far more dangerous. He started paying attention. And what he built in the years that followed, invisible, methodical, and perfectly timed, would put him on the other side of a closing table with Victor Caldwell's signature on a document transferred everything. Please subscribe if you want to see how a wheat farmer with $80 and a library card dismantled a banker's empire one quiet property at a time. Because I promise you, you won't see the ending coming. The Swanson land had been many things over 120 years. It had been raw Montana prairie, broken by a man named Elias Swanson, with nothing but a hand plow and a refusal to quit. It had been a wheat farm through 2 world wars, through the Dust Bowl years when neighboring homesteads blew away like paper, through floods and freezes and seasons so dry the soil cracked open like something wounded. 4 generations of Swanson men had buried their fathers in that ground and kept farming anyway. The land wasn't just property. It was the proof that the family had existed, had mattered, had built something that was supposed to outlast all of them. It took Victor Caldwell one morning to end it. He arrived at 9 o'clock with 2 county officials and a notary, driving a car too clean for a dirt road, wearing shoes that had never touched a field. He carried a leather briefcase and the practiced expression of a man who had done this before, calm, measured, almost kind, which was somehow the worst part of it. He didn't arrive like a man taking something. He arrived like a man completing paperwork. George stood at the fence line and watched them come up the road. He already held the foreclosure documents. He'd been holding them for 20 minutes, reading the same paragraphs over and over as though the words might eventually say something different. They didn't. $80,000 in arrears. 3 consecutive years of low commodity prices and 1 drought that broke the math entirely. The bank had been patient, Caldwell would later say, as though patience were a virtue when it ends in seizure. Behind George, the wheat stood gold and full in the August morning. The farmhouse his grandfather had rebuilt after the 1943 fire caught the early light the way it always did. White walls, wide porch, the kind of house that looks permanent. The red barn beyond it had Elias Swanson's original timber in the frame. George knew every board of it, Ellen sat in their pickup truck at the edge of the yard with Claire and Daniel pressed against her. 9 and 7 years old enough to know something was terribly wrong, young enough to keep asking when they could go back inside. Ellen had no good answer for either of those things. So she held them and said nothing and watched her husband's back at the fence line. Caldwell extended his hand when he reached George. George looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up at the barn, at the house, at the wheat his great-great-grandfather had first seeded into ground nobody else believed in. He didn't take the hand. He signed what needed signing. He said nothing that needed saying. And when Caldwell's car finally rolled back down the dirt road, and the county officials followed, and the farm that had been Swanson land for 120 years was legally someone else's, George made a vow in the silence of his own chest that no one heard. Not yet. The rental house in Billings had 3 bedrooms, thin walls, and a kitchen that smelled like someone else's cooking, no matter how many times Ellen cleaned it. It was 42 miles from the nearest wheat field, and 2 hours from the only ground the Swanson name had ever meant anything. Claire cried the first 3 nights. Daniel stopped talking much for about a week. Ellen unpacked their boxes with the quiet efficiency of a woman determined not to let her children see her break, and George carried furniture up a narrow staircase and told himself this was temporary, so many times it began to feel like prayer. He found work at a feed supply warehouse on the east side of Billings within 10 days of arriving. The shift started at 5 in the morning and ran until the work was done, which was usually well past dark. He loaded pallets, ran inventory, drove a forklift through cold warehouse aisles, and came home with hands that ached in a different way than farming had ever made them ache. Farming tired a man from the outside in. This work just tired him. The pay was $11 an hour. It kept the lights on and not much else. Ellen found bookkeeping work at a plumbing supply company 3 weeks later. She had always managed the farm's accounts, the ledgers, the loan schedules, the commodity price tracking. And it turned out those skills translated cleanly into the kind of work a small business needed done quietly and correctly. She was good at it. She took no pleasure in being good at it. Every number she entered reminded her of a different set of numbers she used to track on a different desk in a kitchen that smelled like her own. They rationed everything. Groceries were planned to the dollar. The children's school clothes came from secondhand stores. Vacations didn't exist. Neither did restaurants, new books, or anything that could be described as comfort. Every surplus dollar went into a savings account. George had opened at a bank that was not Caldwell Agricultural, a fact he noted with a satisfaction too small and too private to share with anyone. And every night, after Claire and Daniel were asleep, and Ellen had gone to bed exhausted from a day that asked too much of her, George sat down at the kitchen table. He spread out whatever he'd been studying that week. Banking textbooks from the public library, legal journals on property acquisition and foreclosure law, agricultural lending regulations, commercial real estate records from 3 counties, pulled from public filings he'd learned to request by mail. He read slowly and carefully, the way a man reads when he knows the information is a weapon and he can't afford to misuse it. He wasn't looking for revenge in those pages. Not exactly. He was looking for something more precise than that. He was looking for the crack in the wall, and he was beginning to find it. It started with a phone call to a man named Ray Decker, whose family had lost their barley operation outside of Roundup in 1985. George had heard Ray's name mentioned at a farm equipment auction 2 years before the foreclosure, back when such things still felt distant enough to be other people's problems. He found the number through a mutual contact, called on a Tuesday evening, and listened for 40 minutes while Ray described an experience so close to his own that George had to set down his pen halfway through because his hand had gone still. Same bank, same process, same timing. Distress at its peak, offer at its lowest, seizure dressed up in the language of regret. George made another call the following week, then 3 more the week after that. He wrote letters to county clerks across central Montana, requesting public records on foreclosure proceedings linked to Caldwell Agricultural Bank going back a decade. The files arrived in manila envelopes over the course of 6 weeks, and George spread them across the kitchen table in the order they'd happened, and read through them with the focused stillness of a man who has stopped being surprised and started being certain. 53 farms in 7 years. The number sat in his chest like a stone. Every single seizure had followed the same pattern with a consistency that could not be accidental. Caldwell's loan officers identified farms under maximum financial pressure. Drought years, commodity crashes, equipment failures, and tightened repayment terms at precisely the moment families had the least capacity to meet them. Forbearance requests were denied. Restructuring options that federal guidelines required to be offered were buried in language or simply never presented. Foreclosure proceedings moved faster than the law required and slower than families could respond to without legal counsel. Most of them couldn't afford. And then the properties moved, quietly, quickly, and always at a significant multiple of what Caldwell's bank had paid to take them. Developers, corporate agriculture operations, land consolidators with addresses in cities that had never heard of Montana wheat. The margins were not the margins of a bank recovering debt. They were the margins of a business that had figured out how to use the law as a harvesting tool. George sat back from the table one night and looked at what he'd assembled. Names, dates, parcel numbers, sale prices stacked against foreclosure valuations. The arithmetic of ruin rendered in public record. He thought about Ray Decker. About the other voices on the other end of those phone calls, men and women who still got quiet when they described the morning the county truck came up their road. 53 families, 120 years of Swanson land. All of it feeding the same machine. He gathered the papers into a neat stack and set them in a folder. He was done grieving. What sat across from him now wasn't a banker who had gotten lucky at his expense. It was a system. And systems, George had learned from enough textbooks by now, had pressure points. He was going to find every single one. By the spring of 1991, the savings account had reached $30,000. It had taken 4 years of double shifts, rationed groceries, and a discipline so total it had become its own kind of lifestyle. Ellen knew what the number meant before George said anything. She'd been watching it grow with the same quiet attention she'd once given to wheat futures. Carefully, without sentiment, understanding that the figure wasn't an end in itself, but the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet. George found the equipment repair business through a classified listing in an agricultural trade paper. A retiring mechanic named Don Paulson had built a modest operation over 20 years. A truck, a trailer, a modest client list of farms across Cascade, Fergus, and Judith Basin counties, and a reputation for showing up when things broke down at the worst possible time, which in farming is most of the time. The business had no glamour and no obvious future. It was exactly what George needed. He paid $22,000 for it. Shook Don Paulson's hand on a Wednesday morning in a gravel lot outside of Lewistown and drove the truck home feeling something he hadn't felt in 4 years. Not happiness exactly. Purpose. The work itself was straightforward. Combine headers, irrigation pumps, grain augers, tractor hydraulics. George had been repairing his own equipment since he was 14 and could diagnose most problems before the farmer finished describing them. He was good at it, fast at it, and because Don Paulson had priced fairly, and George saw no reason to change that, word spread the way word spreads in farming country. Slowly, reliably, and with the particular loyalty that comes from being helped when it mattered. But the routes were never just routes. Every farm he visited was a data point. He noted which operations were expanding and which were quietly contracting. Which families were carrying debt loads that would become unsustainable in a bad season. Which parcels sat adjacent to commercial corridors that hadn't been developed yet, but would be. He kept a ledger. Not the business ledger, a separate one. Private, written in a shorthand only he could read, that mapped the financial geography of 3 counties in more useful detail than any bank's internal records. He incorporated his first holding company in the fall of 1991. Registered in Yellowstone County under the name Bridger Land Associates. Chosen because it sounded like a dozen other unremarkable Montana property entities and would mean nothing to anyone who ran it through a search. The first acquisition was a narrow commercial lot on the edge of Millbrook's downtown district. Landlocked, awkward, dismissed by every other buyer who'd looked at it. George paid cash and told no one. Over the next 18 months, he added 4 more parcels through 2 additional shell entities, each purchase small enough to avoid scrutiny, each one fitting a pattern that existed only in his private ledger and his own mind. Victor Caldwell, had anyone thought to ask him, had never heard of Bridgerland Associates. Nobody was watching George Swanson. That was precisely the point. By the end of 1994, the private ledger had 38 entries. George kept it in a fireproof lockbox beneath the floorboards of the equipment shop he'd expanded twice since buying it from Don Paulson. He reviewed it on Sunday evenings with the same ritual attention his grandfather had once given to the weekly weather report, methodically, quietly, understanding that what he was reading was the difference between survival and ruin. Except the stakes in the ledger weren't weather. They were geometry. And the geometry, after 7 years of patient accumulation, was nearly perfect. The properties formed a ring around Caldwell Agricultural Bank's flagship headquarters on Commerce Street in downtown Millbrook, the way a hand forms around a throat. Not touching yet, not squeezing, but positioned so completely that the pressure, when it came, would be inescapable. A parking lot on the north side of the block, acquired through Bridgerland Associates in the fall of 1991, controlled the primary customer access point for the bank's drive-through lane. A narrow strip of land on the south boundary, purchased through a second entity called Highline Property Group, sat between the bank building and the only viable route for a loading dock or future expansion. 3 adjacent storefronts on the east face of the block had transferred to a third shell company over the course of 18 months. A defunct filling station on the corner, contaminated soil, dismissed by every commercial buyer as a liability, had gone to a fourth entity for $11,000 cash. Each transaction had been small. Each entity had been clean. Each purchase had moved through escrow without drawing the attention of anyone who might have thought to connect the dots. The sellers had been grateful for cash offers on properties they'd been unable to move. The county records showed a scattered collection of minor commercial acquisitions spread across 4 unrelated corporate names. There was no pattern visible from the outside. From the inside, from the Sunday evening perspective of a man sitting alone in an equipment shop with a private ledger open on his knee, the pattern was total. Any serious buyer of the Caldwell Bank building would face an immediate problem. Parking for customers and staff ran entirely through land George controlled. Utility easements for future renovation crossed 2 of his parcels. The only logical path for ground floor expansion in any direction was blocked by properties that Caldwell didn't own and couldn't buy without approaching landlords who didn't publicly exist. The bank building itself was valuable, but the bank building without George Swanson's cooperation was an island, functional for now, but impossible to grow, difficult to sell, and entirely dependent on lease arrangements that George had not yet chosen to enforce. He closed the ledger on a Sunday evening in December and sat for a long time in the quiet of the shop. The trap had taken 7 years to build. It had been constructed one small, unremarkable transaction at a time, by a man nobody in Millbrook was watching. It was complete. Now he needed Caldwell to walk into it. The federal examiners arrived in Millbrook for the first time in the spring of 1995, 2 men in rental cars with government plates and the particular brand of unhurried patience that regulatory authority provides. They set up in a conference room at Caldwell Agricultural Bank for 3 days, requested files that took longer than they should have to produce, and left without comment. Victor Caldwell told his staff it was routine. He told himself the same thing with slightly less conviction. They came back 6 weeks later. This time there were 4 of them, and they stayed for 2 weeks. The problem was structural and had been building for years, though Caldwell had managed to keep it obscured beneath the surface of a balance sheet that looked healthier than it was. The foreclosed agricultural properties he'd accumulated through a decade of predatory lending had been carried on the books at acquisition values that no longer reflected market reality. rural land prices across central Montana had softened considerably. The corporate agriculture buyers and developers who had once provided Caldwell with quick, profitable exits for his seized properties were pulling back from the market. Several large parcels that the bank had expected to flip within 12 months were entering their third year in the portfolio, depreciating quietly and dragging the capital adequacy ratio in a direction that federal guidelines did not permit. The loan default rate was accelerating the problem. Farmers who had somehow held on through the late 80s were finally losing the battle in the mid-90s, and the collateral they carried, land, equipment, livestock, was worth less than the debt it secured. Caldwell had built his fortune on the suffering of farming families, and now the same agricultural crisis he had exploited for profit had circled back to find him overextended, underliquidated, and holding a portfolio of rural real estate that nobody wanted to buy at the prices he needed to sell. The federal examiners filed their preliminary findings in August. Capital adequacy violations, irregular valuation practices on foreclosed asset holdings, recommendations for immediate corrective action. Caldwell's attorneys spent 3 weeks negotiating the language of the formal notice, but the substance could not be negotiated away. The bank needed $2.5 million in new capital within 45 days, or federal regulators would move to place it in receivership and begin liquidating assets at whatever the market would bear. In a town of 3,000 people, $2.5 million in 45 days was not a problem that had a conventional solution. Caldwell made calls. He met with potential investors in Billings and Great Falls. He explored merger options with 2 larger regional banks, both of whom reviewed his books, and declined with the careful language of institutions that recognized a sinking ship. The clock ran without stopping. George Swanson learned about the federal notice through a contact at the county assessor's office on a Thursday afternoon in September. He drove home, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the private ledger for the last time. 45 days was more than enough. George had retained an attorney named Patricia Holloway 18 months earlier. Not a Millbrook attorney, not anyone whose name would appear in the same professional circles as Caldwell's legal team, but a sharp and methodical property lawyer out of Missoula who specialized in commercial real estate acquisitions and asked her clients only what she needed to know to do the work correctly. George had told her enough. She had asked nothing beyond that. It was a professional relationship built on precision and discretion, and it had been waiting for exactly this moment. He called her on a Friday morning in late September and told her it was time. Heartland Holdings LLC had been incorporated 14 months earlier in Lewis and Clark County. A clean entity with no transactional history, no public-facing officers, and no traceable connection to any of the 4 shell companies George had used to assemble his property ring around the Caldwell block. Patricia had structured it carefully, layered it properly, and registered it in a way that would survive scrutiny without revealing anything that didn't need to be revealed. It was the final instrument in an 8-year construction project, and it had one purpose. The offer arrived on Caldwell's attorney's desk on a Monday morning. $2.3 million, all cash, for the Caldwell Agricultural Bank building and the surrounding commercial parcels on the block. A clean acquisition of the flagship property that represented the single most valuable asset on the bank's balance sheet. The offer included a 30-day closing timeline, no financing contingencies, no inspection delays, and a straightforward leaseback provision that would allow the bank to remain in the building as a tenant while it resolved its regulatory situation. Caldwell read it twice and felt the particular unease of a man whose instincts are telling him something his circumstances won't allow him to act on. The offer was too clean. The timing was too precise. No serious commercial buyer appears with a full cash offer in the 4th week of a 45-day federal deadline without knowing exactly what they're doing and exactly why the seller has no room to negotiate. He asked his attorney to run the entity. Heartland Holdings LLC returned nothing of interest. A properly registered Montana corporation with clean incorporation documents and no red flags that any search would surface. He made 2 calls, looking for alternative buyers. Neither produced anything actionable within his remaining timeline. The federal clock did not pause for his discomfort. He signed on a Thursday afternoon in late October, working through 41 pages of transfer documents with the mechanical efficiency of a man who has decided that survival requires setting aside the questions he cannot answer. Page by page, the building that had been the physical center of his empire transferred to a buyer whose face he had never seen and whose name meant nothing to him. His attorney shook his hand afterward and told him he'd made the right call. That the bank would survive. That this was a win. Victor Caldwell nodded and said nothing. Something still felt wrong. He just couldn't find it. The closing was scheduled for 9 in the morning at Patricia Holloway's office in Missoula. Neutral ground, 2 hours from Millbrook, chosen deliberately. The conference room was modest and quiet. A long table, 8 chairs, a window that looked out onto a street where nothing in particular was happening. The notary arrived first. Patricia's paralegal arranged the document stacks in the order they would be signed. Coffee was offered and mostly ignored. Caldwell arrived with his attorney at 5 minutes past 9, which George noted without reaction from his seat at the far end of the table. Caldwell was dressed the way he always dressed, pressed suit, careful tie, the appearance of a man in control of his circumstances. He glanced at the figure already seated across the table. A broad-shouldered man in a denim shirt and a cowboy hat, the kind of hat that had seen weather and work and hadn't been bought for appearance. He registered the man the way people register strangers in professional settings, briefly, without interest, and took his seat. The documents moved in order: transfer of title, lease commencement agreement, easement acknowledgments for the surrounding parcels. Caldwell's pen moved steadily through the pages, initialing, signing, dating, the same sequence he had watched countless farming families perform on the other side of a desk for a decade. The notary stamped each page as it was completed. Patricia Holloway managed the room with quiet efficiency. Nobody spoke beyond what the process required. When the final document had been signed and notarized and the pen had been set down, George reached up and removed his cowboy hat. He set it on the table in front of him and looked across the length of the room at Victor Caldwell for the first time in 8 years. The silence lasted only a moment. He watched Caldwell's eyes move across his face. The sun-weathered skin, the set of the jaw, the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting a long time for a moment he had never allowed himself to rush. He watched the recognition arrive. It didn't come all at once. It assembled itself slowly, the way a cold front moves across open Montana sky, and when it was complete, the color in Caldwell's face had changed entirely. "George Swanson," he said, barely above a whisper. "4th generation," George replied, his voice level and unhurried. "The farm your bank took for $80,000 and sold to developers for $310. The land my great-great-grandfather broke with a hand plow in 1867, and 4 generations of Swansons kept alive through 2 wars in the Dust Bowl and every bad season in between." Caldwell's attorney shifted in his chair. Patricia Holloway remained still. George slid a final document across the table. A lease agreement. Caldwell Agricultural Bank was welcome to remain in the building it had just sold, as a tenant, under George Swanson's name on the deed, subject to annual review. The terms were fair. They were also non-negotiable. One clause had been written into every future renewal, in language that could not be amended without the landlord's written consent. No farming family in financial distress would face foreclosure proceedings without a mandatory restructuring review and a documented accommodation period. The clause had no expiration date. Caldwell read it. He looked up once at the man across the table. Then he picked up the pen. The predator signed as a tenant. The farmer held the deed. 7 years later, George Swanson walked the fence line of his great-great-grandfather's fields in the long gold light of a Montana evening, and the wheat moved the way it always had, in slow, rolling waves that made the land look alive, which it was, which it had always been, which no document drawn up in a bank office had ever truly changed. The white farmhouse had been restored over the course of 2 careful years. New roof, Rebuilt porch, the original timber framing cleaned and reinforced, where a century of Montana winters had worked at the joints. The red barn stood repainted behind it, the same shade it had been in the photographs George's grandmother kept in an album he still had. Elias Swanson's timber was still in the frame. George had checked every beam personally before the restoration crew touched anything. He had purchased the original 400 acres from the development company that bought it out of Caldwell's portfolio, paid fair market value, asked for nothing, accepted no drama in the transaction. It was a real estate deal. What it meant was something else entirely, something that didn't require acknowledgement from anyone other than the man walking the fence line and the ground beneath his boots, that had been Swanson land for 120 years and was Swanson land again. The total holdings now ran to 3,500 acres across 4 counties. The equipment repair business had evolved into a full agricultural services operation. The shell companies had been quietly dissolved once their purpose was complete. The private ledger was in the lockbox still, not because it was needed anymore, but because some records deserved to be kept. Ellen watched from the porch with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, the way she sometimes did in the evenings when the light was right and there was no particular reason to be anywhere other than exactly here. Claire had passed the bar 2 years earlier and was building a practice in agricultural property rights out of Billings, helping farming families navigate the kind of legal complexity that had once seemed designed specifically to defeat people like her father. Daniel was finishing his second year studying agricultural economics at Montana State, asking questions in his classes that his professors found unusually specific and practical for a student his age. Victor Caldwell had sold his remaining stake in the bank at a loss in 1998 and retired to Nevada. The institution operated now under new management with a lending philosophy that bore no resemblance to the one he had built. Its agricultural hardship program, the one written into existence by a lease clause that could not be amended without the landlord's consent, carried the Swanson name on its documentation. 53 families had benefited from it in its first 3 years of operation. George reached the corner post at the far edge of the field, the same corner where Elias Swanson had driven the first stake into raw Montana prairie in 1867, and stopped. He put his hand on the post. The wood was old and solid and it outlasted everything that had been thrown at it. The land remembered. It always had. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever watched something precious get taken and wondered whether patience could be its own form of power, please subscribe to this channel and leave a like before you go. There are more stories like this one waiting. Stories that prove the same thing George Swanson proved in a Missoula closing room on an October morning in 1995, that the greatest revenge isn't taking what belongs to someone else. It's taking back what was always yours and making sure no one can ever take it again.